Hey class, welcome back to World History 2. I hope you're all doing well today. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the First World War. We're really going to dive into it. I've done quite a bit of study on the First World War. Even when I was going for my bachelor's degree, I took an entire semester course called the First World War. And I've done a lot of other study on my own. And it's just a fascinating war to look at. And we're going to be getting into some of the details of the war. And the reason it's such a interesting thing to look at is that the entire European continent gets into the war, but also we have Russia, we have other areas of the world. If you just think about the area that we're talking about in Europe, you have the Western Front where Germany is fighting France and Great Britain, and then later on the Americans there on the Western Front, which we look at in regards to like trench warfare. But there's also an Eastern Front where Germany is fighting the Russian campaign over on the east, and they're fighting Russia there. There's also a Southern Front in the West, which is kind of like an Alpine front where Germany is fighting in the Alps against the Allies. And then there's also a Southern Front in the East where we start looking at the area down in Turkey and what's called the Gallipoli campaign. And a lot of Gallipoli, the Gallipoli campaign was fought by Great Britain against the Turks, but also the Anzacs come up and fight against the Turks, which is the army of New Zealand and Australia. And they basically sail from Australia and New Zealand up to the Gallipoli Peninsula, get off the ships, and begin fighting. So it's just an amazing campaign down there. Also, there's a kind of like a northern campaign, if you want to look at it that way, in the North Sea, where Great Britain and Germany are fighting on the oceans in the North Sea. You have things going on in the Pacific, where Japan's trying to take some islands away from Germany. Also, we have areas of Africa fighting because there's colonies in Africa and Germany has some colonies. And Great Britain wants to take those colonies away from Germany there in Africa. So we have all kinds of things going on in the war. There's great battles that take place. Like I said, Gallipoli in 1915, the Somme in 1916, which we'll be looking at some of these battles. Also, we have some social things going on, mainly in England, where you have millions of men called up to go fight in France. And we have this breakdown of the barriers where it was the aristocracy basically controlling all of England and controlling the social aspects of England. And then you have the lower class. Well, what happens when all of them go to war? And these men who are in the aristocracy, who basically are controlling the land of England, where they go and they're killed in war. And then also what happens when all these men leave to go to war and women step into the workforce. And when this is taking place, the social barriers are broken down, and that's going to have a lasting impact in England. Also in Germany, you have millions of men going to war for the German military, leaving women to go into the workforce there. But because of blockades and because of different aspects in Germany itself, they're running out of money, they're running out of food, people are starving, and so a lot of different aspects are going on. We don't have time to cover all of that. I wish we did, but we don't have time to cover all of that, and we have to hit a lot of the high points. But even so, it's still going to take quite a bit of time to get through this. This PowerPoint is quite a bit longer than usual, so we are going to cover some of these things, but not all of them. One of the things that I do like to point out to students are some of the books that can be helpful in looking at some of these aspects of history. So I have quite a stack here just from my my library. So first off is The Assassination of the Archduke by King and Woolmans, and it's a good look at the actual assassination there of the Archduke and how the war started. Next is The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, and Barbara Tuchman is a great author on the First World War, and The Guns of August talks about how the war started and the opening maneuvers and opening battles. Next is The First World War by John Keegan, again another great one. This is kind of like a standard book. If you're going to be reading or researching World War I, this is a standard book that you would want to look at, as Keegan's First World War. Next is Trench Warfare, 1914 to 1918 by Tony Ashworth, a good look at how soldiers lived in the trenches and fought in the trenches. We also have The Last Great War, again, another general book on British society and how it changed because of the First World War. And then there are many large battles that take place in World War I. Major campaigns, everything from the beginning, which was Verdun, to the Somme, to Gallipoli, to Passchendaele. These are major campaigns that take place. Well, one of them is the Somme, and this is a great book. I just finished reading this not too long ago, and it's by Peter Hart. It's called The Somme, The Darkest Hour on the Western Front. The reason is because the Somme is known for the great slaughter that takes place on the very first day of the Somme, and it is basically the bloodiest day for the British military in history. Over 20,000 soldiers were killed in one day on the Western Front during the Somme campaign, the opening day of the Somme campaign, and it was just such a slaughterhouse for the British military. And it would last for 4 months, but the first day is definitely the day where most of the British soldiers were killed in history in one day. So just a couple of books there if you're interested in more of that. And there's also some books in our bibliography that you could look at. Okay, so stay tuned for the PowerPoint. The First World War, Part 2. So we left off last time with the assassination of the Archduke and all of the countries kind of the dominoes falling, and they're declaring war on each other. So in the fall of 1914, some things take place that also assisted in the declarations of war and just kind of like the news being spread of the Archduke being killed. So it wasn't like the Archduke and his wife were killed and the next day war was declared. There was some, about a month in there. So what takes place? Well, the news of the war, or the assassination of the Archduke and then the declarations of war, they spread like wildfire. It just, again, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have the news on TV. They had to rely on newspapers and print, maybe telegrams, things like that. But the news spread like wildfire because of the new means of communication. Especially, telegrams had been around since the 19th century, but the news just spread. There was cheaply mass-produced newspapers and pamphlets, and so it was definitely overnight that the news had spread, and it fueled intense nationalism. Especially when it was the declarations of war, the country really started getting behind the military, and men were joining up just like no tomorrow. Nationalism exploded. The people wanted to have their nation to be the most powerful, their nation to outshine the rest of the nations. Foreign policy stories were all over the newspaper. People really got into this. You may not think of that today, like politics and policy and foreign relations. Sometimes people don't even pay attention to that today. But back then, that is what was in the newspapers, and everybody was reading it. Even the lower classes, it was cheap. They could buy the newspaper, and the lower classes were mobilizing and coming together and joining up. So here's some images of a couple of newspapers from the time. Assassination may lead to war. War declared by Britain and France. England declares war. Just different headlines that would catch the people's attention, and they'd want to read about it and what's going on, and I'm behind my country, and I want to do my part. Here's an image of some jubilation when war was declared. And so this is in Germany, when Germany declared war, and this is a very famous picture because of when you look at history, especially back during the early times of photography, how this image was captured. And so you see all the people, all the men, they have their hats, they have a lot of the same hats, but they're raising them up in the air, like joyous that Germany has declared war. Well, wouldn't you know it, right down here in this circle is a person, and it's blown up. You may have seen this picture before in a book or something. And so there he is. This is Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was captured in this photograph when Germany declared war. He's all joyous. and he is going to go on and fight in the war. He's going to fight for 4 years and survive, obviously. Okay, so news spread, and as we had left off, Austria declares war, and they want to destroy Serbia, basically. They want to invade and destroy Serbia, but they hold off because they're afraid of Russia. If they attack, Russia will come to the aid of Serbia and attack Austria-Hungary. Now, it takes time to mobilize a military. And so Russia didn't have an army like just sitting there waiting to go into Austria-Hungary in case Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia. It would take some time. So if Austria attacked Serbia, Russia would come to their aid. And so Austria is scared about that. If Austria is attacked by Russia, Germany would come to the aid of Austria-Hungary. So again, just kind of sort through that in your mind. Austria wants to destroy Serbia, but is afraid of Russia. If they attack, Russia will come to the aid of Serbia and attack Austria-Hungary. If Austria is attacked by Russia, Germany will come to Austria-Hungary's aid. So that's kind of like the fear mindset that's going on. July 5th, 1914, Germany gives Austria what is called the blank check. That's the actual name for it. It's called Germany's blank check. And what they basically said was, whatever Austria chooses to do, Germany will come to their aid no matter what. So if Austria invades Serbia, Germany's going to help them out. Germany will be there for them. Even if Russia, attacks, Germany's going to be there for them. German Emperor Wilhelm II, we already talked about him last lecture, was very angry because just 2 weeks before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he met with Archduke Ferdinand on his country estate to discuss the Balkan situation. And at this meeting, Wilhelm II and the Austrian Archduke became pals. It was a good meeting. It was a good time at the country estate. Their nobility, they're upper class, they're very wealthy, and they have this meeting on the country estate, and it's a good time. 2 weeks later, the Archduke is killed, and Emperor Wilhelm II, he's upset about this. He's very angry. So he says, Austria, here's your blank check. Without Germany's backing, the conflict may have been localized in the Balkan region, but Germany's backing would cause the alliances to act. Okay, so that blank check was very important. When you do a more detailed study of this, it looks like it could have been localized just within the Bosnian-Serbian area. Okay, they could have been basically just been a localized conflict. But because Germany gave a blank check and Austria decides they're going to act, it actually led to a world war. Okay, mobilization. Again, as I said, they had a lot of military might, but that doesn't mean they had millions and millions and millions of men in their army yet. These countries had to mobilize their forces. The declarations of war and the mobilization of militaries caused great alarm in Germany because Germany would have to fight a war on two fronts. That's the price you pay for giving a blank check. They would have to fight a war on the Russian front and on the French front. So what happens is France mobilizes their military based on a plan, and their plan is called Plan 17. And what this plan did, it allowed for attacking and maneuvers against Germany, but the plan did not plan for the number of casualties that may occur. And so what happens is Germany declares war on France. Okay, so the way the plan would work is if France began to mobilize based on Plan 17, Germany would be forced to mobilize against France first based on their plan called the Schlieffen Plan, which we're going to look at next. Germany diplomatically attempts to get Russia to stop its mobilization. Okay, so Germany wants to act against France first, knowing that Russia on the Eastern Front is going to mobilize. So Germany tries to get them to stop diplomatically, but Russia refuses. So Germany declares war on Russia. So now they're definitely going to have a two-front war. And so Germany has to put in place their best plan. Okay? So here is France's Plan 17. And you can see, I got my cursor up there again. This is France. Up here's Belgium. Here's France. And here's Germany. And Plan 17 is these army groups right here are going to attack into Germany. Okay, that's Plan 17. Here's Alsace. Remember I had mentioned about Alsace-Lorraine? Here's Alsace. This is Luxembourg. This is Belgium. So that's France's Plan 17, and they didn't take into account how many casualties there are going to be because there would be great casualties. Okay, so that's Plan 17 for France. Next is the Schlieffen Plan of Germany. To deal with a two-front war, Germany relied on a plan that was developed in 1905 by General Alfred von Schlieffen. And you can see his dates, 1833 to 1913. He would die before his plan was even put into place. But this is how they would deal with a two-front war. Number one, Germany would attack France through neutral Belgium in the west and defeat France quickly. Now, this plan counted on a slow mobilization of Russia, of their forces in Russia. So, if they defeat France quickly, then Germany can swing their army all the way to the east again and defeat Russia. But here's the problem. Germany would need permission to move through neutral Belgium. Guess what? Belgium's not going to have it. Number two, movement of 180,000 soldiers to France required huge logistical issue. And then they would have to move them all the way to the east again to attack Russia. Now that 180,000 soldiers is in the plan, but in reality, they're going to move a lot more soldiers into France because of what Belgium does. All right, so keep that in your mind. Schlieffen Plan Part 1. You can see on the map, you have your German forces here in Germany along these lines. You can watch my cursor. And it's basically these big swinging movements that are going to happen. They're going to move through Belgium, move through Luxembourg also, move through them. They're neutral. And they're going to swing around here, cutting off any kind of attempt for England to come help, cutting them off, swinging down, taking Paris, defeating France. That's part one. And this is going to be a really quick movement. That's the plan, a real quick movement. And then, after they defeat Paris and defeat France, then they're going to swing all of their forces over to the Eastern Front. You see this big fat arrow, all the way over to the Eastern Front to meet the Russian aggression on the Eastern Front. This is a massive logistical issue because you're moving massive amounts of armies, men, equipment, all of this. You're doing it by railway, so you have to take all their railways and all that, move all the way around and come back to Russia to fight them. The issue is Belgium. They're neutral and they will not give permission to go through Belgium. Early days of World War I. Germany asks Belgium to move their army freely through Belgium to attack France. Belgium refuses. They refuse on the very same day that Germany declares war on France. So Germany had talked to Belgium before the declaration of war, and they gave them a time period. They gave them an ultimatum. You have like 24 hours to do this. Belgium refuses. Germany doesn't care. Germany invades anyway. They go into Belgium and they go into tiny Luxembourg, and they're going on their way to France. But here's the deal. Remember, speed is the key for part one of the Schlieffen Plan because Russia is going to be mobilizing. So, part one, invade France, beat them. Here's the problem. Immediately there are problems for Germany. Belgium mobilizes 20% of their male population, which is 350,000 men. So instead of going through neutral country, now Germany has to face 350,000 men in Belgium. Belgium stations these men in a belt of strong fortresses that were built in the 19th century. And there was a strategic layout for these fortresses, and we'll see a map in a second. So Germany is going to run into these Belgium forts. 600,000 Germans, okay, so don't forget that 180,000 Germans. 600,000 Germans are hindered for 10 days at Liege, Belgium. That 10 days is critical because in the meantime, as they're being slowed up by the Belgians, Russia has mobilized and they're bringing their forces against Germany on the Eastern Front. So here's a photograph of German soldiers moving into Belgium. They obviously haven't met the Belgians yet at their forts. This is one of the earliest photographs of World War I, early days of World War I. Germany needs to use massive artillery to break these fortresses. Okay, so the Germans are coming across, okay, and you can start seeing these blue dots here. There's red dots and then blue. These are the fortresses, okay, that are set up. And then you have these ring of fortresses around these cities. And usually the cities are the crossroads where the railways will run through. Remember, they required the logistics of railways to move their soldiers for the Schlieffen Plan to work. So they had to take these cities to have the railways. Well, to take the city, they had to take the forts. Well, these forts are heavily fortified and they have a lot of Belgian soldiers in them. And so these forts hinder the German speed. To break these forts, they had to bring in a lot of artillery, which takes time to bring in and set up. Well, some of these forts were so massive that the Germans needed to bring in big artillery to blast the forts. And they had to bring in these guns they were nicknamed Big Berthas. And they were Krupp. Krupp is a factory in Germany that made armaments. The Krupp factories, and they still exist today. They don't make guns anymore, but the Krupp factories. They manufactured these Big Berthas, and it was a 47-ton howitzer that shot a 16.5-inch shell. That means the barrel, the hole in the barrel that the projectile will come out of is 16.5 inches across. So it's a big gun. The shell weighed 1,807 pounds. So just massive. The only way you could transport this thing was by railroad. So it takes time for this to happen. So the Belgians stop the Germans at these forts. The Germans need to bring in big guns on railway. It takes so much time. In the meantime, Russia is mobilizing on the Eastern Front. There's a picture of Big Bertha, one of them. Just see how many men it takes to operate this thing. It's on a railway, to set it up. I mean, just a huge, the hole in this barrel is 16.5 inches across. So just a huge gun. Continuing with the early days of World War I. Gallant Little Belgium. That was the nickname given to Belgium. At these forts, they held the Germans at bay, okay, which gave time for Russia to mobilize, which gave more time for France to be prepared. The Germans then turn on the Belgian population. They basically they were going to punish the Belgian population for not giving them the free access through the country. And there's an event called what is called the Rape of Belgium. And this is where the Germans basically just go crazy. They execute Belgians, they rape women, they kill children. It's just atrocities committed by the Germans as they move through Belgium. Britain declares war because of the invasion of Belgium. and little Belgium held out, allowing France to have a better footing. Okay, and so there's a propaganda picture of this big, bulky German with his Pickelhaube helmet on, and he's got his sword, and he's got this German girl by the nape of the neck with his bloody sword. So you see these pictures in England, you see these pictures in France, and it's like we have got to come to the aid and stop these brutes. Here's execution of some civilians in Belgium. Okay, so now in the early days, Germany finally defeats Belgium and they move into France. Okay, so Germany moves through Belgium into France, but has to divert some soldiers east to stop the Russians who have now begun to invade Germany on the Eastern Front. And we're not going to have time to get into the Eastern Front warfare because there's a lot of battles on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was a lot more mobile. The battles were because it's more of like horse cavalry against cavalry type thing. The battles were a lot more mobile in the Eastern Front, but we're not going to talk much about the Eastern Front. They move through on the Western Front. They meet the French and the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, the British, at the Battle of the Marne River. It's called the Battle of the Marne. There will be several battles of the Marne. But they meet at the first Battle of the Marne on September 6th to the 10th, 1914. It was mostly French. There were 6 French army groups and 1 British army group. Again, the British were still mobilizing on the island of England, and they're still trying to get their armies together. But the French and the British meet at the Marne River to fight against the Germans. And here's the numbers. 1.4 million Germans versus 1 million French and British. Massive numbers of people. And this is just the beginning. It's an Allied victory, and they stopped the Germans 30 miles from Paris, which was a great feat to stop them, because if the Germans captured Paris, they probably would, France probably would have fallen. But they stopped the Germans 30 miles from Paris. Here's the result. It ruined the Schlieffen Plan. The plan that Germany was counting on is done. It ruined the plan. So there's no quick victory over France. And what happens is the war delves into trench warfare, because the Germans were stopped, and they basically come to a stopping point 30 miles from Paris, which both armies then entrench. This entrenchment leads to what is called the race to the sea. The Allied forces, which is the French and the BEF, the British, they battle with the Germans in kind of like a leapfrogging battle movement to the north. So they're basically moving north, battling one another, and digging trenches the whole way. They also do this to the south, down towards Switzerland. But the race to the sea goes to the north, and they're entrenching the entire way. And what this does, this develops into what is known as the Western Front, where the war is going to be fought for 4 years along this front with very little movement, a lot of stagnation, very little movement along this trench system called the Western Front. The trench system from the English Channel to Switzerland is known as the Western Front. This is the race to the sea. And what happens is there's these leapfrogging, notice my cursor, leapfrogging battles the whole way, and they're digging in and fortifying these trenches, and they keep going this way and this way and this way and this way, and they end up having this trench system all the way from the North Sea all the way down through all the way to Switzerland. World War I was supposed to be over by Christmas. All the armies thought this. The Germans thought we would win by Christmas. The English thought we win by Christmas. The French thought we win by Christmas. And really what happens is, by Christmas 1914, it has solidified into a trench warfare system that will basically lead to 4 years of massive death and war atrocity on the Western Front. Okay, now we are not going to be able to have time to talk about the many, many battles that take place. Each year of the war, 1914, 15, 16, 17, 18, all these years they have many, many battles all throughout. But we do want to talk about a couple of the big ones. By Christmas 1914, the Western Front had kind of solidified down into trench warfare. And the future of the war looked like, how can we break this stalemate? That's what basically the strategy was. We have to break the stalemate. Well, one of the ways they wanted to break the stalemate, England came up with this idea of invading the Ottoman Empire in the south. And it's called the Gallipoli Campaign in 1915. It was from February 1915 to January 1916. And I'll show a map here in a minute. But it takes place on the Gallipoli Peninsula, which is modern-day Turkey. Britain, France, and Russia decided we are going to weaken the Ottoman Empire. And you may ask, well, how did they pop in here, the Ottoman Empire? What happened was they secretly allied themselves with Germany at the beginning of the war. It was a secret alliance that takes place. And the Ottoman Empire, which is fairly large, is now part of the Central Powers, and they are south of Russia. And so if Britain decides to attack down there, it will draw forces from the Central Powers, hoping to draw them from the Western Front down into the Gallipoli Peninsula, down to now kind of like, it's almost like starting like a southern front. And if we draw the forces away from the Western Front down into the southern part in Gallipoli, then it will weaken Germany and Austria's Western Front. So if they can take control of the straits, they would have better position to also supply Russia, because Russia is the ally of the British. And if they can take the strait that is near the Gallipoli Peninsula, which is called the Strait of Dardanelles, they can better supply Russia, which will help to fortify or go against the Eastern Front of Germany and Russia fighting. Okay? So the Gallipoli Peninsula campaign was an amphibious landing on Gallipoli, but unfortunately, that stagnates into trench warfare on the peninsula. In January of 1916, 8 months after the fighting, there was no gain of land. The campaign was actually abandoned and the invasion force withdrawn. And really, it was a complete waste because there were 250,000 casualties on each side. On the Central Powers side, which was the Ottomans, 250,000 casualties, and on the Allies side. Now, the Allies side was mostly, it was British, but there were also a lot of Australians and New Zealanders. They came from Australia and New Zealand to fight this battle on Gallipoli. And the thing was, there was this massive mobilization in Australia and New Zealand. These guys, these soldiers, they were called Anzacs, ANZAC, which was basically the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Basically, they got on ships. After they were mobilized and trained in Australia, they got on ships. They sailed from Australia up into the Mediterranean, okay, into where the peninsula was. They got off the ships and went to war and ended up into trench warfare. A lot of these guys were killed. A lot of Anzacs were killed. And it led to a very costly defeat for the Allies. Now, one of the interesting points about the Gallipoli campaign was that a very famous young person, soldier, politician, he was in charge of this because he was the first Lord of the Admiralty in England, and his name was Winston Churchill. He was the First Lord of the Admiralty during World War I, and he helped plan the Gallipoli campaign, which was a disaster. It was a costly defeat of the Allies. Obviously, Winston Churchill would have great prominence in the Second World War because he was Prime Minister of England during the Second World War. Okay, so here is some map for the Gallipoli campaign. So you see up here is Europe, and the Western Front is right here. Okay, so this is the Western Front. This over here would be the Eastern Front, where Russia is fighting Germany. So you have Great Britain and France fighting Germany and Austria over here. Here we have Russia fighting Germany and Austria over here. Well, what they do is they come into the Mediterranean Sea, and they come up here. And there's this little tiny waterway here. This is called the Strait of Dardanelles. And this little tiny land peninsula, this little tiny green piece where my arrow is, that is called Gallipoli. That's the Gallipoli Peninsula. And so the hope is, this is the Ottoman Empire. If they can take control of this, they take control of the peninsula, then they'll control the Strait of Dardanelles, and that way, if they can take control of this area, they can supply Russia through here, through the Black Sea. They can bring supplies through the strait, through this little waterway here, into the Black Sea and help supply Russia. So the whole point of Gallipoli was, if we attack down here, it will draw German and Austrian forces down this way, and it'll draw some German and Austrian forces away from this way to fight down here. When we win, we can then also supply Russia to help fight over here. And that strengthening of Russia may cause more Germans to leave the Western Front and come over here, okay? Which means then we can break through over here in the West. You can just see it's a very ambitious plan to try to draw all these forces. Long story short, it doesn't work. Okay, so here's a blow-up of that. So we have, this is the Strait of Dardanelles, Istanbul here, okay, which this is all Ottoman Empire. Here's the Gallipoli Peninsula. This is where they're going to invade, right down here on the tip. So here's the invasion of Gallipoli, an artistic print. Most of these soldiers have just sailed from Australia. I mean, so they've been on ships for a long time. They get there, they're anchored off the Gallipoli Peninsula. These are basically, they're Turks, they're Ottomans, but it's Turkey. The Turks control this. So they're up here on the on the cliffs and on the hills. They're being bombarded. The British, Australians, and New Zealanders are all landing here under fire to take the land, and it turns into trench warfare on the Gallipoli Peninsula. So you can see they're in the trenches here. Okay, which again, as I've said, it turns into a stalemate, and after months and months and months, the British, Australians, and New Zealanders, they leave, and guess where they go? They go to the Western Front in France. So after fighting on Gallipoli for all these months, the survivors, these veterans of Gallipoli, they're then moved to France. And they get there in 1916. Well, in 1916, there's another very ambitious plan by the British, by the Allies, called the Somme Campaign, the Battle of the Somme. And that's what we're going to talk about next. In 1916, we have the Battle of the Somme, which lasts from July 1st to November 18th, 1916. And some of these soldiers, they fought on Gallipoli. The Battle of the Somme is a massive frontal assault by the British and French against entrenched Germans along a 20-mile front in the Somme River Valley. Okay, so in northern France, there's the Somme River. And the plan is to have this big, massive push with, so many soldiers are going to leave their trenches, go across no man's land, which is the area between the trenches, between the
British trenches, British-French trenches, and the German trenches. They're going to cross no man's land. They're going to punch through the Germans' lines real fast, and then be able to, take advantage of that and exploit and attack the rear of German forces, and be able to basically gain a lot of territory and maybe even bring Germany to its knees. It's supposed to be a quick punch. Unfortunately, it ends in a bloody massacre in no man's land. It is. They did not punch through anything, and it just led a bunch of British to the slaughter. Here's the key thing about the Battle of the Somme. It is the deadliest battle for the British Army in history. It was the deadliest day for the British Army in history. The first day of the Battle of the Somme, when the captains of all of these companies in the trenches, when they blew their whistles and they went over the top, 20,000 British soldiers were killed in one day. I mean, you just think about that. How many men were killed every single minute? I mean, every second. They went over the line, over the top of the trench along this 20-mile front, and they faced machine guns, and they were just mowed down. 20,000 dead in one day. 57,000 were wounded in one day. I mean, just a massive amount of soldiers became casualties. There's a picture. It's kind of blurry, but there's a picture of a trench, and there's dead soldiers all around. They came out of their trench and were killed. Okay, so that was the Battle of the Somme. 1917, the United States joins the war. Two big things happened in 1917. The first, the United States joins the war, and second, Russia leaves the war. Okay, so 1917, the United States joins the war. Germany had been conducting unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic with their submarines, and they were actually sinking American ships. And this one American ship was sunk. It caused a lot of civilians to die. And so finally, the United States, who was remaining neutral, they decide to join the war. Also, there was this event called the Zimmermann Telegram. And the Zimmermann Telegram was intercepted by the Americans, which outlined an alliance between Germany and Mexico, where Germany was trying to get Mexico to attack the southern border of the United States. It didn't lead to anywhere. That it didn't happen, but there was this telegram that was intercepted. So finally, the United States decides we're going to join the war. President Woodrow Wilson leads America into the war, and this is the boost that the Europeans needed. By 1917, it was clear that this had become a war of attrition. It was just one country slugging it out with another country, killing. I mean, so many men were being killed in the trenches and on no man's land, and these pointless assaults of going against one another, being mowed down by machine guns. Well, basically what was happening, Great Britain was running out of men, France was running out of men, Germany was running out of men, and so America joining the war really boosted the Allies' forces. So obviously they joined the Allies, the Great Britain and France. They joined them, and they went over to France with fresh troops. And so there was a song called "Over There" that became very famous about the Americans coming, or I should say going over there to Europe. And also, you may have heard of the word doughboys. U.S. soldiers were called doughboys, and it's kind of mysterious where this term came from, because the term actually originated in the Civil War. Usually, it's attributed to the Civil War soldiers eating hardtack biscuits. Like they would make this dough that they would make into biscuits. Well, it was used in World War I. They were called doughboys, and a lot of times it's attributed to the donuts that the Red Cross would give to the American soldiers and the British and all that. So they were called doughboys. And there's a picture of one there on the right. 1917 and 18, again, I had mentioned the Russians would leave the war. In 1917, there's a revolution in Russia, Russian Revolution. Russia pulls out of the war, abolishes the Tsar. This is the time period of Rasputin. We're not going to go into him, but Rasputin is there and in Russia. Well, this actually gives a boost to Germany, and because it's no longer a two-front war. Russia pulls out, they stop fighting, and so Germany is able to move their forces from the Eastern Front over to the Western Front, gives them a little bit of a boost. They do this spring offensive, but it's too little too late. They're not able to really exploit that, and Germany is basically just running out of soldiers, running out of supplies. So many men have been killed. There are many battles and engagements with the Americans, but the American military power and might is just too great. The war begins to drag on into 1918. Germany knows it's losing. Everyone knows that Germany is losing. Austria is just like almost non-existent now because they're now completely, they've run out of men. But it just the end is in sight. But they just keep grinding away at the Western Front, doing these pointless attacks. But finally, there's a plan for an armistice, which is an end to the fighting until a treaty can be drawn up. And at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, so November 11th, 1918, the war stops. And it is all quiet on the Western Front. 4 years of war and artillery and death comes to an end at that time, which that actually becomes, that date, November 11th, that date becomes Veterans Day in the United States. Okay, so we'll talk about the post-war happenings in the next PowerPoint. But what I want to talk about to finish this up is First World War warfare. And basically, it's summed up with this. It's old war tactics in modern warfare. There's a lot of innovations that take place during World War I and the evolution of warfare to being a modern war, but the tactics that the commanders used were old war tactics, where it was basically you had these big armies, and if we just send our soldiers against the big armies, we'll defeat them and we'll win. Well, that's old style warfare, because the modern warfare had these innovations such as the machine gun or poison gas. And so if you just send your armies out against machine guns, well, they're going to be mowed down like grass. And that's what took place. Old war tactics in modern warfare equals massive casualties. So we're going to go through, just briefly explain each one of these, and then I have some pictures coming up. Number one, trench warfare. That's a modern tactic. It's not. World War I was not the first war that had trenches, but it was definitely the first global war that used trench warfare. On Western Front, it had it. Even the Eastern Front, it had some. We saw Gallipoli campaign in the South, that had it. There was trenches everywhere. Barbed wire. That was put in no man's land to tangle up the troops, and it was just so much barbed wire used in no man's land. Some of it were just massive fields of barbed wire. They would put barbed wire over the top of some trenches so that when the enemy would be charging across no man's land, if they made it to the next trench, if they made it to the enemy trench, they couldn't get in because there was barbed wire all over it. The machine gun, I mentioned that already, just soldiers charging across no man's land being mowed down by belt-fed machine guns. Poison gas. Soldiers just sitting in their trenches and gas would come across no man's land. Usually they would have to depend on the winds, the wind movement to make sure it's being blown the right way. You don't want your gas coming back on yourself. So the gas had to be going across. So if there was favorable winds, they would release gas, poison gas, which would be like mustard gas, which was a yellowish color, or chlorine gas, and that would it would kill people. Mustard gas would cause the lungs to to rupture. You would basically bleed inside your lungs, and you would drown to death on your own blood. Flamethrowers were new. Tanks were new. I mean, these big, Goliath-type tanks would come across no man's land, and this was later on in the war. Tanks were developed later on in the war. The development of the airplane, where you had first was air reconnaissance, so you could see where the enemy was, but then second was actual air combat, where you might hear the Red Baron, where you had these biplanes fighting each other in the skies. Primitive bombings, where the planes would go over trenches and bomb. There were these German bombers that would go over London. They actually bombed London. There were submarines, like I mentioned earlier. Submarine warfare was beginning in World War I, and they would be sinking ships and just submarine tactics. Zeppelins, or hot air balloons. Zeppelins were rigid airships. They actually had a frame to them that they could go over and with reconnaissance or bombings, and again, they would bomb London with Zeppelins. There were hot air balloons that would go up and focus on taking pictures and seeing where the enemy was, but the hot air balloons were easy targets for the aircraft. So if someone went up in a hot air balloon to take pictures, the aircraft would come in and try to shoot at the hot air balloons. And then just the idea of total war, where total war is a movement of putting everything of your nation into the war footing. So the economy, the industry, the people, everything went to fight the war. And so there was total war in World War I. It would also happen again in World War II. Total war. A good example of this is that instead of making automobiles, again, automobiles were new at this time in the early 20th century. Instead of making automobiles for people to go and just drive around in, everything would be going towards the development of war machines, trucks and tanks and all of that. So just total war. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of these things. The first I want to talk about is trench warfare. Trench warfare is a type of land warfare using occupied fighting lines consisting of trenches or trench systems that protect soldiers from enemy small arms and artillery fire. Now, the trenches of World War I were not pleasant. They had basically moved underground. The men moved underground. They lived in the trenches. They had kitchens in the trenches, latrines in the trenches, dugouts for where the captain would be with the company headquarters would be like in this dugout, which would be deeper in the ground. Some of them were quite elaborate, but it was still just a dirty, muddy, diseased, ridden place. There was lice, there were rats. I mean, just not a good place to be. There was a sickness that came about called trench foot, and trench foot was the name given to when someone had rotting flesh, and it was rotting of waterlogged flesh, mainly of the feet, because there was standing water in some of the trenches with no drying of the feet. And a lot of this was in the Allies' side, the British, the French, the Americans. Their trenches were not in a good place. When the stagnation of trench warfare kind of solidified down into the trench system with no man's land in between, the Germans had a better area. They had more of the higher ground. Some of their trench systems were in soil that was good for drainage or was actually chalky soil, so they could actually kind of carve out their trenches. But the British, on the other hand, or the Allies, they had lower ground. A lot of times they were in valleys, and so the water would collect there. And so their trench systems would have water in them. They would have to have duck boards on the bottom of their trench system to be able to stand in, so they weren't standing in water all the time, but a lot of times it was muddy and dirty and just a lot of water. So here's just an image of a trench system. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at here. Over here is no man's land where my cursor is, and so the bad guy or the enemy would be over on this side. Okay, so here's no man's land. So you have a front line trench, and they would have them. These would be jutted like this. So in case in case a bad guy or an enemy jumped into your trench, they wouldn't be able to take a machine gun and just shoot straight down the trench and just kill everybody. There are these jagged kind of alternating walls and movements so that the machine gun wouldn't be able to shoot straight down a trench. So that's what that was for. This is a forward listening post, an LP, which is they would dig out into no man's land and put somebody out there to listen. Okay, then that's the frontline trench. Then you had a support trench in the back, and that would have a communication trench. How would you get up to the front line? You have to go through this kind of a trench. You wouldn't jump up here because you might get shot. So they would move through that. So this is a support trench, and this is where the second line would be. So there would be guys back here. Up here would be the guys like maybe shooting or fighting or holding the line. These guys back here can take it easy a little bit. Maybe this is where medical is, that sort of a thing. This is where you would stage to go up to the front. And then you actually had another line, which would be through this reserve trench, and that would be back here. And you had another line of trenches that would connect them to a reserve trench. So this would be where these guys are not doing the fighting, but they're holding. They're here in case for if they need more support or reinforcements, they could come up from a reserve trench. Would be back here. And then, as I said, there'd be a company headquarters where this would be the captain would be. He'd have his desk, his planning table, usually a little deeper in the grounds. There's some steps going down into an underground. Maybe his bed would be here. So his company would be up here, but he would be back here with the planning. Okay, so that's a diagram of trench warfare. Here's some pictures. Some guys going over the top. This guy here is in a waterlogged trench, so you can see if you can't get out of the trench and you're in this water, your feet are going to start to rot. So there's that guy. These are some Germans, and they went hunting, and they were able to kill some rats that were in their trench. Those are some pretty big rats. I wouldn't want that thing crawling on me at night. Machine gun. So again, these are Germans. You can see with the Pickelhaube helmet on with covers. They have actually fabric covers over their helmets. So again, if you're British and you're running across no man's land, this is what you're facing. You're facing this machine gun shooting at you. And they were just like being mowed down. Just a lot of guys being killed by machine guns. Complete waste. Here's gas attacks. So this is early gas attack where basically they had these gas canisters, and the wind would definitely have to be right for the gas to go across no man's land to the British trenches. These are Germans. Later on, they actually had gas shells, artillery shells they would shoot these shells over into the British trenches. The shells would explode, but instead of exploding with a lot of shrapnel that would kill a bunch of men, it would explode and gas would come out. Here's a German gas masks, and they even have one for their horse. Or they stuck one on their horse, I should say. Here's a drawing of the flamethrower. So again, if you're running across no man's land and you made it to the German trench, you got to face this. You got to face a bunch of flames being thrown at you. Here's a tank. This is a British tank. Okay. They were called the Mark tank, M-A-R-K. They had numbers after them, Mark 7 or something. So this is a British tank. It was designed to be able to get over trenches. So these guys are taking a ride. This is a German tank. These are British, looks like British officers. But this is, I guess, a captured German tank. So you can see their tank was a little bit different in design. But again, this was new, and so if you were a soldier in a trench and this big thing is like coming at you and shooting, it had machine guns. These windows would be machine guns shooting out of it. It would be terrifying. an airplane, kind of a biplane. I could have had a better picture than this, but what I wanted to show you was this is a very famous man. This is a German, and his name is Hermann Göring, and he was a fighting ace in World War I. He shot down a lot of the Ally airplanes. Hermann Göring. Hermann Göring would go on to become the commander of the Luftwaffe in World War II, and he became second in command to Adolf Hitler. He became a very good friend of Hitler in the very beginning of the Nazi movement, and he would become the commander of the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force in World War II. So that's Hermann Göring as a young man. During World War II, he was actually quite fat. He became a very fat man in World War II. And to finish out our PowerPoint lecture here, this is another pretty famous photograph because who's in it. This is an early picture of Adolf Hitler. He was a runner in World War I. He fought in World War I from 1914 to 1918. He survived the war, obviously, which was very rare that you would live all 4 years because so many men were killed. He was wounded. He was gassed. In fact, when World War I ended, he was in the hospital because he was blinded by gas, which would wear off. If you ever read the book Mein Kampf, which Hitler wrote after World War I, Mein Kampf means my struggle. He writes about his World War I experience and how he was in the hospital when the war ended, and when he heard that the war ended, he just sobbed and sobbed because he was so upset that Germany lost. But that's Adolf Hitler there. He doesn't have his little mustache yet. He still has a pretty big mustache, which was of the times. But that was Hitler in World War I. He would end the war as a corporal because of his heroics. He would have the Iron Cross, though he would have the wound badge. So, in his own right, he was kind of a brave soldier. We don't want to think about Adolf Hitler in any good terms, but he went to war for his country. Again, the Nazis did not exist yet, but he went to war just like so many other Germans did, and he fought for Germany. And he was actually Austrian because he was born in Austria, but he fought for Germany and survived and was awarded the Iron Cross. So that's Adolf Hitler. And that's it for our second lecture, PowerPoint lecture for First World War. I'll see you in a second.
Okay, class, that's it for today. And wow, it's quite a long lecture and just so much to get through. And we could have just continued talking and talking and talking. I mean, there's battles that we didn't talk about. There are other famous ones, such as the First, Second, and Third Battle of Ypres, Belgium. And then there's a campaign for Passchendaele, which I didn't even really touch on besides mentioning it, I think, one time. But just so much that we could talk about, which we don't have time. And it just opens up doors for you for the future if you would just want to research or read on those different campaigns. But also, we didn't really talk about too much of the leaders of these different countries or campaigns, such as Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who were Germans who became very famous on the Eastern Front and became more famous later on. And we also didn't talk about Kitchener in England, who was the guy who pretty much commanded all of the forces for the British, and he also was in charge of raising up the armies for the British. We saw some pictures there of Hermann Göring and Adolf Hitler, and there's others that really cut their teeth in World War I, who would then go on to lead the countries that were involved in World War II. I had mentioned Winston Churchill with the Gallipoli campaign, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, but then went further and he became Prime Minister of England during World War II. It's just so interesting that these guys went to war for their country in World War I and then would lead their countries in World War II. And there's many others that we could look at and focus in on. It's just that we don't have the time to do it. And I do hope this interests you and you are able to then go on for your own further reading and further research or whatever it may be. But that's it for the look at the actual battles and all of that for World War I. Next time we're going to be looking at World War I Part 3, which is going to be the post-war peace agreement and how the war comes to an end. See you then.